You need to tear down that dock now.
This pontoon is completely illegal.
The lake had always been my sanctuary. Nestled at the far end of the cul-de-sac, my property stretched down to the waterline, and with it came the small dock I had built years ago. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't extravagant, just sturdy wood, well-maintained and practical. For me, it was a place of peace, early morning fishing, late afternoon sunsets, and quiet evenings where the rippling waves muffled the chaos of the world. But tranquility rarely lasts when someone like Karen lives. Next door. Karen was more than just a neighbor. She was the self-appointed guardian of the homeowners association. She carried herself with the smugness of someone who thought she owned the entire neighborhood. If there was a lawn a quarter-inch too long, she noticed. If trash cans weren't rolled in within the hour of pickup, she wrote it down. And now, her attention had turned to my dock. It started with a letter tucked under my doormat. The HOA logo stamped across the top gave it weight, but the handwriting scrawled inside was unmistakably Karen's. She claimed my dock violated HOA standards for waterfront structures and demanded its immediate removal. According to her, it was an eyesore, a hazard, and a violation of the covenant rules. I reread the letter multiple times, puzzled. I had combed through the HOA's regulations when I first built the dock, and nothing had prohibited such a structure. In fact, other homeowners along the lake had similar or even larger docks, some with covered slips, some with lighting, some far more elaborate than mine. Yet none of them, as far as I knew, had received such a letter. This wasn't about the rules. It was about Karen. She had always harbored a quiet resentment toward me, though the reasons were never clear. Maybe it was because my property bordered hers, and she couldn't stand not having control over what I did. Maybe it was because I rarely attended HOA meetings, refusing to be dragged into her endless debates about neighborhood uniformity and property value preservation. Or maybe it was simply that Karen thrived on conflict, and I was her latest target. The following week, another notice arrived. This time, the language was sharper, more formal. She had clearly used the HOA's official channels, demanding compliance or facing fines. My dock, she insisted, must be removed within 30 days. Failure to do so would result in escalating penalties. It wasn't just an inconvenience, it was personal. I drove around the lake, studying every dock I could see. Some leaned crooked into the water, others were splintering from neglect. A few even had boats tied up that looked like they hadn't been registered in years. Yet none of those seemed to bother Karen. It was only my dock, my property, my peace of mind. That night, I pulled out the HOA bylaws. I sat at my kitchen table, with a stack of documents, a highlighter, and a growing sense of determination. If Karen wanted to play this game, I was going to play it better. Hours passed as I combed through the dense text. There it was, Section 7, Subsection C. Waterfront structures permitted so long as they do not exceed a certain size and are maintained in good repair. My dock fit those criteria perfectly. Nothing in the language even hinted at my being in violation. But then, as my eyes scanned further down, I noticed something else. Section 8, Subsection F, Boat Regulations. All boats moored on HOA property must be registered with the state, maintained in seaworthy condition, and comply with environmental standards. And that's when it hit me. Karen's boat. Her pride and joy, a hulking pontoon she paraded around every summer, wasn't just oversized, it was outdated. The paint was peeling, the engine coughed smoke, and I had overheard her bragging once about skipping the renewal of her registration because the rules were too ridiculous. If what I suspected was true, her boat wasn't compliant with the very regulations she was so eager to throw at me. The irony was too perfect. Still, I knew I couldn't rush this. If I went after her without proof, she'd spin the narrative, make herself the victim, and weaponize the HOA against me. Karen was skilled at twisting stories, at turning neighbors into allies with half-truths and exaggerations. I needed hard. Evidence. So I started my quiet investigation. The next morning, I walked past her property under the guise of a casual stroll. Her pontoon sat heavy in the water, ropes straining at its cleats. I snapped a photo of the expired registration sticker. On the hull, the faded year clearly visible. Later, I checked the state's online registration database. Her boat wasn't listed. It hadn't been for years. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together. Not only was her boat unregistered, but by HOA standards, it was illegal to keep it on the lake. The very authority she had used to come after me could now be turned against her. The balance of power was shifting, and Karen didn't even know it yet. I gathered my evidence, documented everything, and drafted a formal complaint. Unlike her hastily written letter, mine was airtight, backed by regulations, photos, and public records. If Karen thought she could bully me into dismantling my dock, she was about to learn just how quickly the tide could turn. And as fate would have it, the confrontation came sooner than expected. The day after I filed my complaint, Karen stormed into my yard, waving yet another letter in her hand. Her face was flushed, her voice carrying across the water as she shouted accusations about my illegal dock. Neighbors peeked out from behind curtains, watching the drama unfold. But before she could finish her tirade, a white pickup truck pulled up to her property. Two men in state uniforms stepped out, clipboards in hand. They walked straight past me and onto her dock, where her pontoon floated idly in violation. Karen froze. And in that moment, as the officials began inspecting her boat, I knew the game had changed. The dock wasn't the story anymore. Her boat was. The hour of reckoning had arrived. The officials stepped onto Karen's dock with the practiced precision of men who had done this countless times before. Their presence alone shifted the atmosphere around the lake. Neighbors who had been peering through blinds now stepped onto porches pretending to sweep, water flowers, or check mail, all under the guise of casualness, but with eyes fixed on the scene. Everyone knew something significant was unfolding. Karen's posture betrayed her panic. She stood stiff, clutching her papers like a shield, her bravado draining with each step the inspectors took closer to her boat. The pontoon floated lazily in the water, the sun glinting off its faded paint, its neglected trim, and the unmistakably expired registration sticker still plastered along the hull. It was the kind of detail most would ignore, but in this moment, it was damning evidence. The men circled the boat methodically. They bent to examine the registration, scribbled notes, snapped photographs, and tested the ropes that moored it. The pontoon shuddered against the dock, and with it, Karen's illusion of authority shook too. I stood silent on my property, watching from the edge of my own dock. There was no satisfaction in the moment yet, only quiet anticipation. For years, Karen had wielded the HOA like a weapon, using rules not as guidelines for harmony, but as ammunition for control. She had turned neighbors against one another, fined families for trivialities, and demanded compliance in areas where none was warranted. But now, her empire of intimidation was crumbling in front of the very people she sought to dominate. The inspection unfolded like a slow unmasking. The officials opened compartments, tugged at wires, and tested the engine. When the motor coughed black smoke into the air, audible gasps carried across the water. Neighbors whispered, phones discreetly lifted to record what was quickly becoming. A spectacle. One of the men returned to his truck, retrieved a binder, and flipped through pages until landing on a section he needed. Regulations, rules, and statutes, the very things Karen had so often used against others, were now arrayed against her. Her face flushed red as she attempted to argue, her arms gesturing wildly, her voice rising higher with each futile attempt to deflect blame. But no amount of bluster could erase the truth. Her boat was unregistered. It had failed to meet environmental standards. It was, by every measurable criterion, illegal to be on the water. The officials issued their verdict. With calm finality, marking her boat as non-compliant and unsafe. Then, almost ceremoniously, they affixed a bright notice to its bow, a seizure order. The crowd of neighbors, once cautious, now openly murmured. Some smiled faintly, others shook their heads. Everyone knew what the notice meant. Karen's pontoon was no longer hers. It would be removed, and with it, her status as the queen of the cul-de-sac began to unravel. As the officials returned to their truck, they radioed for a tow vessel. The news spread like ripples across the lake. Karen's prized possession was about to be taken from her, not weeks from now, not after lengthy appeals, but that very hour. She retreated up her lawn in a flurry of anger and disbelief, leaving the boat behind. For the first time in years, Karen had no words to silence her critics, no rules to shield herself. She was exposed. I remained on my dock, a quiet witness to her downfall. It wasn't victory yet, not fully, but it was the first crack in her armor, and once a crack appears, it rarely stays small. The tow vessel arrived with the rumble of its engine, a deep growl that echoed across the water. It was a specialized craft, designed for exactly this task. The crew worked efficiently, securing lines, checking their paperwork, and preparing to haul the pontoon away. Every sound, the clank of chains, the slap of rope, the groan of metal, carried with it a weight Karen could not fight. Neighbors recorded, whispered, and speculated. The woman who had demanded my dock be destroyed was now losing the very symbol of her power. And not just losing it quietly, but publicly, in full view of the community she had sought to dominate. The tow vessel began pulling the pontoon from her dock, the water foaming in protest as it was dragged away. Karen appeared once more, shrieking from her lawn, waving her papers like they could undo reality. But the sight only fueled the quiet satisfaction of the neighborhood. For so long, her word had been law. Now her word meant nothing. When the boat finally disappeared around the bend, carried off to impound, a hush fell over the lake. The drama had ended, but the implications lingered. The balance of power had shifted. For me, the dock remained exactly where it was, untouched, sturdy, legal. And that was the point. The structure she had tried to condemn still stood strong, while her own pride and joy had been dismantled in front of everyone. But I knew Karen. She wasn't the type to surrender. Quietly, this humiliation would not be the end. It would be the beginning of her retaliation. She would regroup, scheme, and search for a way to claw back the control she had lost. As the sun dipped lower and neighbors retreated indoors, I stood at the high water's edge, staring at the empty space where her boat had once been. The lake seemed quieter, freer, more open without it. But the battle wasn't finished. Karen's pride had been wounded, and wounded pride is often the most dangerous. The real war for the neighborhood was only beginning. The morning after Karen's boat was seized, the lake felt different. The air seemed lighter, the water clearer, and the silence across the shoreline was almost peaceful. Yet beneath that calm surface lurked something darker. For a woman like Karen, humiliation was never the end. It was fuel. By noon, the emails began circulating. Neighbors whispered about Karen's furious late-night campaign, messages she had sent to the HOA board, accusing me of harassment, misconduct, and endangering the community. She painted herself as the victim of a vindictive neighbor who had exploited obscure technicalities to destroy her property. She claimed I had orchestrated the seizure out of spite, that I was a threat to the harmony of the neighborhood, and that immediate action needed to be taken against me. The board, stacked with her longtime allies, took notice. Most of them owed their positions to Karen's relentless organizing, her ability to guilt and pressure homeowners into attending meetings, and her promises of keeping property values high. For years, she had cultivated loyalty through intimidation and flattery, creating an unshakable grip on the HOA's power structure. Even without her boat, She still had influence. And now she was using it. Within days, I received a letter. This time it was not Karen's handwriting or tone. It was official, stamped with the HOA seal, and signed by the board president. The letter accused me of abuse of HOA reporting systems and warned that any future complaints I submitted would be reviewed for malicious intent. At the same time, they reopened the case against my dock, citing community standards and demanding once again that I remove it. The irony was suffocating. Karen had lost her boat for failing to follow the rules, yet the board twisted the situation until I was the villain. They framed my actions not as compliance with the bylaws, but as a personal vendetta. They ignored the fact that I had merely pointed out her violation of the very rules she weaponized. It was a classic Karen tactic. When exposed, never admit fault. Instead, shift the blame, escalate the conflict, and force others to defend themselves. But I wasn't the only one who saw through it. Neighbors who had witnessed the seizure began murmuring their doubts. They had seen the expired sticker, the smoking engine, the seizure notice slapped on the bow. They had recorded the officials hauling the boat away. They knew the truth. Yet many of them feared speaking up at meetings, wary of becoming Karen's next target. Still, cracks in her support began to show. One family across the lake, long silent during HOA disputes, suddenly voiced frustration. Another homeowner quietly told me they had been fined 3 times for minor lawn violations while Karen's own hedges were overgrown. Stories surfaced of double standards, selective enforcement, and favoritism. The boat incident had lit a fuse, and the explosion was only a matter of time. Karen, however, doubled down. She called an emergency HOA meeting, summoning the board and homeowners into the clubhouse. The gathering was tense, the air heavy with resentment and suspicion. She arrived dressed as though stepping onto a stage, carrying binders of documents. Photographs of my dock and pages of citations she claimed proved its illegality. The meeting dragged on for hours. Karen spoke with the fervor of someone on trial, weaving her narrative of persecution. She pointed to the bylaws, misquoting passages, twisting clauses, and ignoring context. She described my dock as unstable, unsafe, and a liability to the community. She declared that if it remained standing, it would invite lawsuits, insurance hikes, and plummeting property values. The board listened, nodding along, though not all of them seemed convinced. Some shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, aware of the spectacle, aware of how Karen's performance reeked of desperation. When the floor opened for comments, a surprising thing happened. Several neighbors, emboldened by the recent events, spoke out against Karen. They reminded the room of her boat's seizure, her hypocrisy, and her years of selective enforcement. They questioned why their docks had never been scrutinized, why her violations had been ignored, and why the rules seemed to apply differently depending on who was involved. Karen's face hardened, her mask slipping as the tide turned against her. She tried to interrupt, to shout down the voices of dissent, but the murmurs grew louder. For the first time, she wasn't just battling me, she was battling the neighborhood she had ruled for years. Still, the board refused to make my final decision that night. They postponed the vote on my dock, claiming they needed more time to review the evidence. It was a stall tactic, one Karen had no doubt orchestrated, buying herself time to regroup. As the meeting ended, the atmosphere was electric with division. Lines had been drawn, neighbors left in clusters, whispering their thoughts, some rallying. Behind me, others clinging to Karen's authority. Back at home, I sat on my dock under the moonlight, the wooden boards cool beneath my hands. It was still there, still mine, still perfectly legal. But I knew the fight wasn't just about planks and pilings anymore. It was about control, pride, and the future of the community. Karen had lost her boat, but she had not lost her grip on the board. Not yet. And if there was one thing I knew about her, it was that she would stop at nothing to get revenge. The storm was far from over. The days following the HOA meeting carried an unmistakable tension. The neighborhood, once an uneasy but quiet community, now felt like a battleground where every lawn, mailbox, and flower bed became a potential flashpoint. Neighbors avoided eye contact on morning walks. Conversations that had once been friendly were replaced with guarded nods, and the hum of gossip spread faster than the ripples across the lake. Karen, wounded, but unbroken, launched her counter-offensive with the precision of someone who had perfected the art of control. The first salvo came in the form of fines. One by one, envelopes landed in mailboxes, each containing notices of violations. Grass half an inch too tall. Paint a shade too bright. Trash cans visible for minutes longer than permitted. It was clear the fines weren't random. They were targeted. Homeowners who had spoken up against Karen at the meeting suddenly found themselves under scrutiny. A cracked paver in a driveway became a $50 penalty. A forgotten holiday decoration earned a $100 citation. For one family, a child's bike left leaning against the garage resulted in a safety hazard ticket. The message was clear: dissent would be punished. My own mailbox was soon stuffed with letters. Karen and her allies on the board claimed my dock had now accumulated ongoing violations. Each week added another fine, each notice stacking higher, each dollar amount climbing steeper. The absurdity of it was almost laughable, given that my dock remained perfectly compliant with the bylaws, but there was nothing amusing about the harassment. She couldn't take my dock physically, so she tried to drown me in paperwork and financial pressure. The community began to fracture. Some homeowners, weary of conflict and fearful of Karen's wrath, sided with her. They muttered about neighborhood harmony and protecting property values, parroting her language in the hopes of avoiding her ire. Others, fed up with the bullying, began rallying quietly in opposition. They shared stories of unjust fines, whispered of appealing to the county, and murmured about organizing a recall of the HOA board. The lake became a mirror of the division. On one side, Karen's supporters clustered in tight groups, hosting their barbecues with forced laughter, their eyes darting toward my property. On the other, allies of quiet resistance gathered in smaller, hushed conversations, their frustration growing but their fear holding them back from open rebellion. Karen, meanwhile, thrived on the chaos. For her, power wasn't simply about rules or property values. It was about dominance. She wielded the HOA like a cudgel, striking down anyone who dared to question her, and she wore her victories like badges of honor. Losing her boat had been a blow. But if she could bring me down, if she could destroy my reputation, she could rewrite the story of her humiliation into one of triumph. And so, she escalated. One morning, I woke to find a sign staked in the ground, near my dock, planted there by the HOA. It bore an official seal and a bold declaration: unsafe structure, removal pending. The absurdity of it made me laugh bitterly, but the message wasn't meant for me alone. It was meant for the entire neighborhood, a public shaming, a declaration that Karen still controlled the narrative. Neighbors slowed their walks to read the sign, some smirking knowingly, others shaking their heads. Karen, watching from her porch, reveled in the display. But her theatrics carried unintended consequences. Each time she lashed out, each time she overplayed her hand, she exposed the lengths she would go to maintain control. And slowly, the whispers against her grew louder. One neighbor, tired of the endless fines, requested records of the HOA's finances. Another began compiling a log of violations ignored on Karen's property, documenting overgrown hedges, peeling paint, and a rotting fence. Photos circulated discreetly through text messages and private group chats, each one another nail in the coffin of her credibility. The turning point came when a family down the street received a $200 fine for planting flowers that were not within the approved color palette. The absurdity struck a nerve, and murmurs turned into outrage. The family refused to pay, and word spread quickly. Others began following suit, ignoring fines, challenging notices, and quietly pooling resources for legal advice. By the time summer reached its peak, The neighborhood was no longer the quiet lakeside retreat it had once been. The HOA, once seen as a necessary mechanism for order, had become a weapon of fear. Karen wielded it with reckless abandon, her wrath growing with every sign of resistance. Yet the more she tightened her grip, the more the community slipped through her fingers. The fines had multiplied beyond reason. Homeowners faced charges for mailboxes a shade off from approved beige, for fence panels warped by humidity, for garden gnomes deemed unsightly. One family was cited for hosting too many cars in their driveway during a birthday party, another for leaving their recycling bin visible for an hour after pickup. The absurdity was no longer hidden. It was blatant. Neighbors, who once suffered in silence, began to snap. The quiet resentment that had simmered for years now boiled over into open defiance. A group of homeowners, weary of being bullied, began meeting in secret. They gathered at kitchens, garages, and even at the far end of the lake, away from Karen's watchful gaze. Their voices, once timid, grew stronger with each meeting. Their plan was simple: expose the corruption, challenge the board, and strip Karen of her power once and for all. Evidence became their weapon. Neighbors compiled photos, emails, and records. They dug through meeting minutes, highlighting discrepancies in votes and finances. They tracked fines and penalties, charting out patterns of Karen's selective enforcement. And they didn't stop there. They began documenting her own property: the peeling shutters, the weeds choking her flower beds, the unapproved shed she had built behind her house years ago. The hypocrisy was undeniable. For me, the storm hit hardest. The HOA's threats escalated into legal notices, claiming I owed thousands of dollars in unpaid violation fees tied to my dock. The absurdity was laughable, but the intimidation was real. Karen wanted me broken, crushed beneath the weight of paperwork and debt, a warning to anyone else who dared defy her. But her obsession with me had backfired. The seizure of her boat remained fresh in everyone's mind, a vivid reminder of her hypocrisy. While she paraded herself as the defender of standards, her own violations had been exposed in the most public and humiliating way. That image of her pontoon being dragged away from the dock lingered in conversations, whispered with satisfaction by neighbors who had suffered under her rule. And so, when the rebellion began to take form, I was no longer alone. Neighbors rallied quietly around me, offering support, information, and solidarity. What had started as my personal battle had grown into a community fight. The pivotal moment came with the petition. Circulated quietly from house to house, it called for a vote of no confidence in the HOA board and demanded Karen's removal. Signatures poured in faster than anyone expected. Families who had been fined, shamed, or silenced added their names with determination. Even those who had once been loyal to Karen began to waver, fearful of being swept away in the tidal wave of discontent. Word of the petition reached Karen quickly. Predictably, she lashed out. She stormed through the neighborhood, demanding loyalty, threatening those who dared sign, and promising even harsher consequences. Yet each tantrum only fueled the movement further. The board, caught in the middle, scrambled to maintain control. Some doubled down on their loyalty to Karen, fearful of losing their positions. Others quietly distanced themselves, sensing the shifting tide. Meetings grew heated, neighbors shouting over one another, factions openly clashing. The illusion of Karen's authority was shattering. Piece by piece. Through it all, my dock remained. Untouched, sturdy, and perfectly legal. The very structure that Karen had tried to erase now stood as a symbol of resistance. It was more than wood and nails. It was proof that she could be defeated. As the petition neared the threshold needed to trigger a vote, Karen grew desperate. She unleashed one final wave of fines, blanketing the neighborhood with threats and penalties. But this time, no one folded. Families ignored the letters, tossed them aside, or pinned them to their refrigerators like trophies. The fear that had once paralyzed the community had been replaced by anger, and anger had given way to unity. One evening, as the sun set over the lake, the rebellion became visible. Neighbors gathered on their docks and porches, chatting openly, no longer afraid of Karen's gaze. Children played in yards that had once been monitored for violations. Cars parked along the street without worry of tickets. It was as if the neighborhood had exhaled, reclaiming the freedom it had long been denied. Karen, isolated on her porch, watched with fury. Her allies had dwindled, her threats had lost their edge, and her empire was collapsing. The seizure of her boat had been the first crack, but the rebellion of her neighbors was the breaking point. The petition was delivered the next day, signed by a clear majority of homeowners. The vote was inevitable. The community had spoken, and Karen's reign was nearly at an end. But the story wasn't finished. The battle still had to be fought in the open, and Karen, cornered and desperate, would not go quietly. The showdown was coming. The night before the vote, the neighborhood was silent in a way that felt almost staged, as though the entire cul-de-sac held its breath. Curtains were drawn tight, porches were dark, and even the lake seemed still, the water reflecting a muted sky. Everyone knew what was coming. The battle that had simmered for years, Karen's reign of fines, threats, and control, was about to be tested in the open. Karen herself was far from quiet. Rumors spread that she had been calling neighbors one by one, pressuring them to stand with her, threatening lawsuits and promising retaliation if she lost. Her desperation was palpable, a frantic scramble to hold on to the power that had defined her existence. Yet the more she clawed, the more people slipped away. The next evening, the community gathered at the clubhouse. For years, HOA meetings had been dull, sparsely attended affairs where Karen and her allies dictated policy to a half-empty room. But this time, every seat was filled, with homeowners standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. The air buzzed with anticipation, the tension sharp enough to taste. Karen entered with her usual flair, binder in hand, her posture rigid, her eyes sweeping the room as if daring anyone to defy her. But the murmurs that followed her were not of respect. They were whispers of resentment, amusement, and impatience. The tide had turned, and she knew it. The board attempted to maintain order, but the energy in the room was beyond their control. The petition had forced the issue, and the vote was no longer a distant possibility. It was happening now. One by one, homeowners stood to be counted, their voices carrying across the room. The numbers stacked quickly, and each tally was another blow to Karen's crumbling empire. For a brief moment, she tried to fight back, waving documents, citing bylaws, and insisting the petition was invalid. She accused me of orchestrating a conspiracy, claimed the seizure of her boat had been unlawful, and painted herself as the victim of harassment. But the room no longer belonged to her. Her words, once weapons, now fell flat. The very people who had once feared her now shook their heads, rolled their eyes, or openly laughed at her performance. The vote concluded with a clear majority. Karen and several of her closest allies were removed from the board. The decision was final, binding, and undeniable. The room erupted, not in cheers or applause, but in a collective exhale, a release of years of tension, frustration, and resentment. For the first time, the HOA was free from Karen's grip. The days that followed were transformative. The new board immediately suspended the wave of fines that had crippled families. They began reviewing budgets, uncovering discrepancies, and drafting fairer policies. Homeowners who had once hidden in fear now gathered openly, talking, laughing, and planning community events without the shadow of Karen looming over them. As for Karen, her downfall was swift and merciless. Stripped of her authority, she became a pariah in the very neighborhood she once ruled. Neighbors avoided her, unwilling to engage with the bitterness that clung to her every word. Her attempts to rally support fizzled, her threats ignored, her power dissolved. She spent her days glaring from her porch, a relic of a past that no one wanted to return to. And the most poetic symbol of all remained the empty space at her dock. Where her pontoon had once floated, there was nothing but still water. The image was a constant reminder of the hypocrisy that had undone her, the beginning of her unraveling. Her greatest humiliation had become permanent, and no amount of bluster could erase it. For me, the resolution was simple, yet profound. My dock remained exactly where it had always been, sturdy and legal, a testament to resilience. What had started as a personal feud had evolved into a community's awakening. I hadn't just defended my property. I had helped ignite a movement that freed the neighborhood from tyranny. Sometimes, victories come in silence. There were no parades, no celebrations, just the quiet satisfaction of freedom restored. The lake returned to what it had always been meant to be, a place of peace, reflection, and community. Neighbors began to smile again, to greet one another without fear of scrutiny. The cul-de-sac, once suffocating under Karen's rule, felt alive. Karen never forgave me, of course. She never forgave anyone. She lingered in her house, isolated and bitter, a reminder of what happens when power is abused. But her reign was over, and that was enough. As the seasons changed and the leaves turned gold, I sat once more on my dock, watching the sunset stretch across the lake. The boards beneath me were warm from the day's sun, the water lapped gently at the edges, and the air carried no weight of conflict. The fight was over. The dock was mine. The neighborhood was free.